Hey guys, tonight we step back into the mud-caked lanes of an old English village boots squelching, apron damp, air thick with the scent of peat smoke, manure, and someone frying onions just a little too close to a manure pile. It's early, the sky's still gray with sleep, and already the square is humming. Wooden carts rattle in, hay pokes through burlap, and someone's goat has definitely broken free again. It's market day, but not the kind you're expecting, because beneath the cabbage crates and piglet pens, something far more personal is being traded. People's futures. You're not here to buy onions. You're here to witness something stranger and quieter, a marriage negotiation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a village square of your own, or a cozy bed somewhere across the world, let me know your location and the time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear it before you see it, the low hum of bartering, the slap of hands on wooden stalls, and the occasional bleeding interruption of a very opinionated sheep. Between the produce sellers and the fishmongers stands a cluster of men in wool cloaks, sipping weak ale and murmuring with the guarded intensity of gamblers. They're not betting on dice tonight. They're weighing something far more complicated: daughters, land, futures, and whether William's barley yield will outlast old Harold's aching hip. Marriage here isn't really about romance, it's logistics. Futures arranged over tankards and a pig carcass. And though the air smells mostly of damp wool and wood smoke, there's an undercurrent of tension. Somewhere not far off, a girl adjusts her shawl and wonders if she'd be spoken for before the sun's at its highest. Historians still argue whether these markets were informal gossip fests or structured matchmaking rituals. But today, you're standing in the square, your boots caked in the same mud, watching a life quietly shift with each firm handshake. You linger beside a leaning fence post, pretending to inspect a cart of onions while your ears tilt toward the real business of the day. The talk isn't about prices for pork or who's selling goose eggs. It's about girls. Specifically, who has one ready for marriage, and what she's worth if you throw in a field and a half of barley. Across the muddy square, two men squint at each other like they're deciding the price of a stubborn mule. One scratches his beard and says something about broad hips and no dowry debt. The other swishes a mug of ale, unimpressed, and mutters, "A shame she can't spin flax without snarling it." You realize, with a quiet exhale, that marriage here is math. People talk in units of ale, bushels, and grazing rights. A daughter is rarely described by name. She's my eldest, or the one with the butter churn. A good match might balance out decades of debts. A bad one might cost a pig and your pride. One father gestures with his thumb toward a girl by the cloth stall. She's trying not to listen. Her hair is plaited neatly, her sleeves clean. He lists her like inventory, knows her herbs, weaves tight, strong arms. He pauses. Might even sing if there's time. Her worth: 3 sheep, a copper pot, and if the groom's family is lucky, a sack of salt thrown in. Historians still argue whether these negotiations were more symbolic than serious, but when oxen and daughters were priced the same, it's hard to ignore the overlap. You spot a man inspecting a cow's hooves one minute and discussing a wedding agreement the next, barely blinking between the two. And when the deal is nearly done, they toast not to love, but to barley yields and healthy sons. You wonder if anyone here even remembers what falling in love feels like, or if they simply count acres and hope affection comes later. You step aside as a cart creaks past, its wheels half swallowed by the muck. On the back wedged between sacks of grain, and a creaky wooden stool sits a dowry chest. Not a treasure box, mind you, but a plain oak trunk, iron-hinged, scuffed at the corners. Inside, the bride's entire value, neatly packed and accounted for. A dowry isn't just a gift. It's an economic statement, a bundled promise of what the bride brings to the new household. You peer in discreetly as someone lifts a lid to show off contents: a butter churn, 3 well-used linen sheets, a clay jug with only 1 chip, and a goose that looks mildly offended to be part of the deal. These aren't lavish offerings, they're survival tools. A dowry might include a goat, if you're lucky a kettle passed down from grandma, or maybe a spindle wrapped in red thread for good luck. And while some families can afford extras like silver spoons or embroidered cloth, most scrounge together what they can. The practical outweighs the sentimental, but not all dowries are helpful. Occasionally, whispers swirl through the market of attached debts. Maybe the bride's father owes a neighbor 2 pigs. Maybe she comes with a cousin who also needs housing. One unfortunate groom once received a bride, a goat, and a very aggressive rooster that terrorized the village for weeks. Love, as always, comes with fine print. Historians still debate the true legal weight of these dowries. Were they enforceable promises or just village tradition? But you can tell, watching the cautious nods and double-checking of cloth bundles, that people here take them seriously. A mismatched dowry can haunt a marriage longer than bad weather. You trail behind one newly engaged couple, the bride carrying her own chest, wobbling slightly under its weight. She doesn't smile, but she walks forward. That's enough. You duck under a timber-bird eave as the clouds roll in low, and suddenly, the whole square seems to lean toward the nearest tavern. Not for warmth, not for gossip, but for something far more ceremonial. The wedding is about to begin, or at least the rustic version of one. No organ music, no flowing veils. Just 2 families, a few half-washed neighbors, and several pints of something that smells suspiciously like vinegar with ambition. Inside the alehouse, it's dim and damp, lit mostly by the glow of the hearth and the sheen of sweat on every forehead. The bride and groom stand awkwardly between 2 barrels, their hands clasped, not lovingly, but firmly, like 2 farmers agreeing to co-manage a cow. There are no rings. Instead, someone pours ale into 2 chipped mugs and hands one to each. You watch as they drink not daintily, but deeply, then pass the mugs back to be refilled. There's no priest in sight, just the local reeve, who scratches something into a ledger with a charcoal nub, nods, and declares the pair joined in the eyes of God and market law. The final step, a sticky handshake. Palm to palm, ale-wet fingers squeezing as onlookers cheer. It's oddly charming. A wedding wrapped in barley and spit instead of gold and lace. Historians still argue whether such hand-fasting ceremonies counted as legally binding, or if they were just socially accepted placeholders until the church caught up. But in villages like this, people didn't wait for parchment, they waited for harvests. One man swears under his breath that the ale was stronger last wedding. Another leans in and bets a hen that the couple won't last till Yule. The bride smirks. She probably heard him. Outside, someone's carving their initials into a bench. Not for romance, just to prove they were here. Because in this world, memory often fades faster than ale. You catch a whiff of something pungent. It's not the usual blend of sheep sweat and damp hay. This is sharper like pickled onions left too long in the sun. You turn and there she is, the village matchmaker. Short, bent slightly sideways, with a grin that reveals exactly 1 tooth, and even that one looks like it might give up at any moment. Her name might be Mavis, or Maud, or that old bat, depending on who you ask. She isn't officially hired. No one ever writes her name down or thanks her in public, but everyone listens when she leans in. Because in this village, where a wrong match could leave you tied to a lazy baker or a pig farmer with a short temper, she's the one who just so happens to know which daughters are ready and which sons have ambition, or at least get shoes. You trail behind as she whispers to a concerned father. She pulls a wilted herb bundle from her apron and tucks it into his hand, a gesture or maybe a subtle bribe. Later, she shuffles toward a quiet girl selling eggs and murmurs something that makes the girl blush and look away. Mavis isn't unkind, just efficient and mildly terrifying. Historians still debate the true influence of these local matchmakers. Were they deal brokers or just nosy neighbors with time on their hands? But watching her work, you can see the gears turning. She remembers whose dowry includes 2 sheep, who got into a fistfight last midsummer, and which family is quietly hiding a cider debt. Sometimes she lies, of course. Strong teeth, she tells a visiting cousin, motioning toward a boy who definitely swallowed a molar during last week's scuffle. But what matters isn't truth, it's trust. And no one here marries without her blessing, or at least her nod. She winks at you as she passes, the scent of onion and ale clinging to her shawl. You're not sure if it's a friendly gesture or a warning. You find yourself squeezed onto a wooden bench that wobbles every time someone laughs too hard, which is often. The long table groans under the weight of crusty bread, pickled turnips, a suspiciously gray stew, and enough ale to float a monk. The wedding feast has begun not with music, but with a hiccup loud enough to silence the corner flute player for a full beat. It's not what you'd call romantic. There are no floral centerpieces or choreographed dances, just bowls being passed elbow to elbow, children darting underfoot, and someone's uncle reciting a hymn that only 3 people seem to recognize, and none of them in tune. You glance toward the newlyweds. The groom looks flushed, partly from drink, partly from the pressure of making conversation with a bride he may have only met last week. She's nibbling cautiously, eyes scanning the room, as if she's still deciding whether she's married or just attending a particularly chaotic harvest dinner. A jug spills near your foot someone's 3rd refill. No one panics. A woman calmly drops a crust of bread onto the puddle to soak it up, then eats it without blinking. You suddenly realize this is less about the couple and more about the village. A wedding is a rare excuse to gather, eat, drink, and maybe forget the ache of backbreaking labor for a night. Historians still debate how much formality was actually involved in these rural celebrations. Church records mention solemn ceremonies, but villagers' oral histories lean toward wild toasts and off-key fiddle songs. You're starting to believe the latter? At the far end of the table, someone shouts a riddle involving goats and barrels. Laughter erupts, half sincere. A scuffle breaks out near the hearth, but it fizzles quickly when someone offers a fresh loaf as peace offering. You lean back against the creaking wall, full from stew, ears warm from secondhand ale fumes, and realize there may be little sentiment in the air, but there's something comforting about a feast where no one pretends to be anything but themselves. You trail behind a group heading toward the bride's family cottage, past the last of the trampled wildflowers and ale puddles. Someone mutters, "Time to see what she's worth," and for a moment, you think they mean her character. But no, the real proof lies in a wooden chest with iron latches, already dragged to the center of the room like a prize peg at fair. This is the linen chest, the bridal dowry box. And tonight, it's not just storage, it's a declaration. The lid creaks open and you peer in with everyone else. Neatly folded linen sit in stiff stacks napkins with careful corner embroidery. Sheets so white you wonder who managed to bleach them in this mud-spattered world, and a single lace hem that likely took months to stitch. But linens are only the beginning. Out come the other tokens. 2 wooden spoons, one nearly smooth from decades of use, a chipped bowl with a painted rooster, a bundle of dried herbs tied with faded ribbon, and tucked in one corner beneath a scrap of blue wool, a small sack of coins, barely enough for a horse's shoe. The final item is listed aloud by the bride's father, one Awe, currently tied out back and known to produce steady milk but a nasty temper. Historians still argue whether this public display was meant to impress, intimidate, or simply formalize what was being handed over. But to the gathered eyes neighbors, potential in-laws, and one nosy child nibbling on a spare carrot. It's a performance. The bride stands quietly beside the chest, eyes lowered, her hands clasped so tightly they've gone pale. This isn't just her household gear, it's her entire reputation, folded and counted before witnesses. Any missing item could spark whispers for months. As the last blanket is lifted and the crowd begins to murmur approval, the chest is shut with finality. Not locked, just closed, as though her girlhood is being packed away with the linens. And now only the sheep remains to be fetched. You overhear the first whisper near the bread stall. A baker's daughter vanished the morning of her wedding, last seen sprinting past the hedgerow with her apron still flapping and a traveling fiddler 2 steps behind her. Her dowry left behind, along with the groom, who now drinks twice as much and insists she was kidnapped by romance. Runaways aren't common, but they happen, especially when the match smells more like old potatoes than compatibility. You stroll past the alehouse and catch another tale. A father who traded his daughter for a cart, only to discover the groom's family never owned a cart. It had been borrowed for the occasion from a cousin with a loose moral compass and 3 wheels. And then there's the most curious tale of all the rented groom. You pause beneath a crooked elm as a stooped man explains how, one winter, a family couldn't secure a proper match in time. So they paid a stranger handsome, quiet, possibly from Dorset, to stand in for a symbolic ceremony. The groom vanished by morning, taking the feast leftovers and a pair of borrowed boots. No one speaks his name now, but someone still refers to him as Sir Lancelot. Historians still argue whether such substitutions were widespread or just exaggerated village gossip, but you're beginning to suspect truth and tale often share a cup in this place. You pass a girl sewing beneath a window and she looks up with a knowing glance. Not fear, just caution. Everyone here knows someone who dodged a vow, reversed a promise, or woke up beside the wrong man entirely. These aren't fairy tales, they're market risks. Love, after all, is a gamble. But in this world, it's not your heart that's at stake. It's your bedding, your goat, and possibly your family honor. And if all else fails, you can always rent a smile and hope no one checks the paperwork. You find yourself wandering toward the edge of the village, where the thatch thins and the sermons soften. A small stone church sits modestly on a rise, its bell long rested silent, its priest still polishing the same lectern with more devotion than enthusiasm. He watches the village with narrowed eyes, and today, his frown seems especially deep. You follow his gaze to the tavern below, where laughter bursts through the door like warm steam. Inside, another wedding is underway, though the word is doing some heavy lifting. There's no bands read, no candles lit, and certainly no choir. Just 2 ale-damp hands clasped in mutual communions, witnessed by 3 men too drunk to spell matrimony. Technically, church law requires banns to be read on 3 consecutive Sundays' announcements that a couple intends to marry. It gives the village time to object, share gossip, or remember that the bride may still be promised to the miller's nephew. But not everyone likes waiting. And some couples, especially the more rebellious or pertinent ones, prefer to say their vows with only God, beer, and one honest liar present. This practice, often called alehouse weddings or handfastings, made clergy bristle. Historians still argue whether these counted as legal marriages or were just socially tolerated shams. The church tried to crack down, but how do you enforce holy matrimony when half your parish is getting hitched behind the barley sacks? You slip into the tavern side room and catch the final line. I take thee, mostly. Someone snorts. The groom winks. A neighbor nods as witness and takes another sip. Paperwork? None. Rings? Optional. Love? Questionable. Outside, the priest sighs and walks back inside, muttering something about sin and soup rotting too fast in summer. He'll still be expected to bury these same couples years from now, preferably in separate plots. And as the sun dips and laughter spills into the evening air, you realize vows here are less about heaven and more about who's sober enough to remember them the next day. The night has grown thick with chimney smoke and the scent of roasted onions, and you're ushered rather unceremoniously toward a modest cottage at the edge of the green. The newlyweds are inside, so are their parents and their parents' cousins, and possibly someone's sheep. Yes, you've stumbled into a very old tradition, equal parts mortifying and matter-of-fact. It's the first night confirmation, and no, privacy is not on the guest list. A few hundred years ago, particularly in rural England, the community didn't just toast the marriage, they checked the receipts, so to speak. Because a union wasn't fully binding until it was consummated, and families had a vested interest in knowing it actually happened. Why? Because a non-consummated marriage could be annulled, which meant dowries might be refunded, property returned, and honor heaven forbid blemished. So here you are, seated awkwardly near a creaky straw mattress, watching as the bride and groom are gently nudged toward bed by well-meaning relatives, as if they might otherwise forget. Someone's aunt drops a heavy wool curtain across the room, hardly soundproof. Another guest passes around cider while keeping one ear cocked. You sip cautiously. Some confirmations were symbolic, simply showing the bed, or untying the bride's garters in front of witnesses. Others were less symbolic. One particularly nosy variation involved inspecting the bed linens the next morning for proof of virginity, though historians still debate how reliable these displays were. A few regions even had designated elder women who would stay nearby, just in case someone needed help. Or a stern reminder, you can't tell what's happening behind the curtain. But the father-in-law clears his throat loudly. The mother-in-law hums a tune. You swear you hear someone whisper, "Get on with it." The fire crackles. The cider burns your throat. Eventually, the curtain pulls back. The couple reemerges, cheeks flushed, not necessarily from passion, and someone shouts, "Mazel tov," though you suspect they meant mutton's off. Either way, the deed is done, or at least declared done. And you, having witnessed far too much and far too little at once, quietly excuse yourself into the night air, where the stars at least offer some blasted silence. You find yourself in a smoky cottage parlor, tucked between embroidered cushions and the creak of seasoned timber. Across from you sits a widow-lace cap askew, eyes sharp as flint, and a teacup that's definitely stronger than tea. She's not mourning. She's plotting, and you're about to get an earful. In the marriage markets of Old England, widows weren't sideline relics. They were often seasoned players who knew how to turn grief into leverage. Unlike unmarried maidens, they came with land rights, legal know-how, and in some cases, a working knowledge of how to fake a limp when negotiating dowries. Their value wasn't in innocence, it was in experience. You sit politely as she tells you about her first husband gone before the second barley harvest. Good with sheep, bad with money, she says with a shrug. The second one, a merchant, was better dressed, worse tempered. And now, she's in no rush, which you suspect is code for waiting for a baron to sneeze himself to death. Widows in this era had options younger women didn't. Some held dower, land's property set aside for their use, and could remarry on their terms. Historians still argue whether widows truly had social freedom or just knew how to weaponize charm over chessboard pies. One thing's certain, you don't play cards against them. The teacup clinks as she refills your drink and smiles sweetly. You suddenly feel like you might be the next pawn on her matchmaking board, but it's too late now. She's already asked where your family keeps its pigs. The breeze carries the clink of metal as you stroll past another marriage exchange. Not cows this time, but coins gleaming faintly in a velvet pouch. You blink. A dowry made of money? It feels out of place in a world where goats were once the gold standard and a healthy ox was worth a dozen marriage proposals. But slowly, things are changing. England's economy, once rooted in barter and beasts, is inching toward currency. Landlords want rent and silver pennies. Bakers demand coin for bread. And fathers, with daughters to place, are learning to count more than livestock. They're counting shillings. You overhear a discussion by the ale cart. One suitor's offering £2 in coin, a feather mattress, and a promise to never move in with his mother. The girl's uncle, surprisingly business-minded, mutters about inflation. It's not romantic, but it is practical. The shift isn't smooth. Some villages cling to tradition, still tying courtships to butter churns and parcels of grain. Others experiment with coins, contracts, and brace-yourself liars. Historians still debate whether this financial shift empowered women or simply priced them differently. A few even argue it made it easier for the lower classes to climb, however slightly, the marital ladder. The clink of coins feels colder than the bray of livestock, but it's the sound of an England evolving. You watch as an elderly couple counts coppers by lantern light, sealing a match between their grandchildren. There's no feast, no fiddler, just math. And perhaps a little hope that silver won't rust like promises sometimes do. You didn't expect the shouting, or the ribbons tied tightly around a woman's upper arm, marking her as available. But here you are, wincing as a man with an ale-slosh beard bellows his bid. Welcome to a wife sale, yes, an actual legalish English wife sale. It isn't quite what you imagined. There's no stage, no auctioneer's gavel, just a livestock market repurposed for human hearts, or what's left of them. The woman stands calmly, rope looped loosely around her wrist, not to restrain her, but to symbolize her ownership. When the right price is shouted, 3 guineas and a donkey cart, the crowd erupts in cheers and jeers. You wonder how this could have ever been real. But in 18th and even early 19th century England, when divorce was near impossible for common folk, this was the loophole. Historians still debate how consensual these sales really were. Some women reportedly arranged the buyer themselves, eager to leave. Others, not so lucky. One man tries to outbid another with a piglet and a keg of cider. A wife grins behind her hand. Was that a laugh? You're not sure if this is liberation or spectacle. Maybe it's both. You back away slowly as another ribbon is tied. Somewhere, a fiddler starts playing as if this were just another Saturday market. And maybe, for a while, it was. You flip through a dusty stack of parchment and land on a tale that starts romantic and ends ... with a pig. Not metaphorically a literal pig, claimed in court as compensation for a failed engagement. Welcome to the world of love deeds, broken promises, and some truly bizarre lawsuits. It turns out that in Old England, walking away from a betrothal wasn't just heartbreaking, it could be legally actionable. A man might sue if the bride-to-be ditched him after he'd already handed over his best goat, or paid her father an ale and turnips. One record shows a groom demanding either his dowry back or, failing that, the sow that had been promised as part of the package. You read another case. A woman sues not for heartbreak, but for a promised cheese wheel. The groom's defense? He never said which cheese wheel. Historians still argue whether these lawsuits were taken seriously by local courts or simply tolerated as a way to let villagers blow off steam. Either way, love and livestock remain tightly linked. The most surreal case in your pile: a father suing a jilted groom not for money, but for public embarrassment at the alehouse, where everyone had heard about his daughter's spoiled bread rolls. Whatever that means, you sit back, blinking. Love, it seems, has always been complicated and oddly edible. You find yourself at the edge of a quiet turning point. The village square still smells faintly of hay and roasted onions, but the shouts of dowry deals and linen chest haggling have grown fewer. The marriage market, once rowdy, transactional, and oddly theatrical, is beginning to dissolve. It doesn't happen all at once. A few old fathers still try to trade their daughters for a cow and half a barrel of cider, but the buyers are thinning out. Young couples now elope to nearby towns, ink signatures on paper, and leave livestock out of it entirely. Money is cleaner, contracts are clearer, and love, though still a gamble, is less tied to acres and oat yield. You overhear one old matchmaker mumbling about how no one respects a good butter churn anymore. Another laments the fall of wife auctions, muttering that ribbons used to mean something. And yet some things linger. There's still a toast or two to bride's value. Family elders still peek into chests and ask careful questions. At a wedding last week, someone actually spat in their hand before shaking on a dowry clause. So maybe it hasn't vanished. Maybe it's just gone quiet. Historians still argue whether it was industrialization, church reforms, or rising individualism that truly ended the marriage market. You just know this. The old rituals fade, but their scent lingers in the corners of village halls and family lore. You take one last look at the emptying square. The mud has dried, the coins have taken root, and the girls, well, most of them walk their own paths now.